Welcome back. It is a little past 5 in the morning on April 18, 1906, and San Francisco is still asleep. Bakers are pulling the first loaves from brick ovens on Sacramento Street. A handful of cable cars sit idle in their barns, waiting for the day's first riders. In a room at the Palace Hotel, the tenor Enrico Caruso is sleeping off the applause from the night before, when he sang Don Jose in Carmen to a packed house at the Grand Opera House. None of these people know that in a few minutes, the ground beneath their city is going to move in a way it has not moved in generations, and that by nightfall, much of what they know as home will be gone. Using AI reconstruction, restored photographs, and detailed archaeological and historical records, we are going to walk through this city as it truly was, hour by hour, before, during, and after the event that would define it forever. And at the end, we will stand in those exact same spots as they look today, so you can see with your own eyes what survived, what vanished, and what rose in its place. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what San Francisco had already become, and where it came from. Barely 60 years earlier, this stretch of the California coast was a quiet settlement called Yerba Buena, a scatter of adobe buildings and a few hundred residents clustered around a natural cove. It belonged first to indigenous Ohlone communities for thousands of years before Spanish missionaries and Mexican settlers arrived in the late 1700s, and it remained a modest, foggy outpost of a few hundred souls right up until 1848, when gold was discovered in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. Within 2 years, the population exploded from under 1,000 to roughly 25,000, as prospectors, merchants, and dreamers poured in from every direction. Streets were laid out in a hurry, often in straight grid lines that ignored the city's brutal hills entirely, a decision that would shape the character of San Francisco for the rest of its history. The people building these first wooden storefronts and boarding houses had no idea they were laying the foundation for one of the great cities of the American West, and they certainly had no idea what was waiting for their descendants under the earth itself. By 1906, that gold rush camp had become a metropolis of some 400,000 people, the largest city on the Pacific Coast and the financial and cultural capital of the American West. Market Street ran nearly 3 miles from the waterfront to the base of Twin Peaks, lined with granite and steel buildings that would not have looked out of place in Chicago or New York. The Palace Hotel rose 7 stories around a glass-roofed courtyard called the Grand Court, with 800 rooms and marble columns imported from Europe, and it was considered one of the finest hotels on earth. The new City Hall, finished only a few years earlier after nearly 3 decades of construction, was crowned with a dome taller than the one on the United States Capitol, a proud and slightly overambitious symbol of a city determined to prove itself. Cable cars climbed grades of nearly 20% up Nob Hill, where lumber and railroad fortunes had built mansions of imported marble and hand-carved wood. And yet, for all its grandeur, this was not a finished city. Sewer lines were still being extended into newer neighborhoods, water mains were aging and inconsistently maintained, and city officials had spent years arguing over building codes that were only loosely enforced, especially south of Market Street, where wooden tenements were packed tightly against one another. San Francisco in 1906 was ambitious, unfinished, and in places, dangerously fragile, even as its skyline reached for the heavens. The city's spiritual and civic life reflected its remarkable diversity. Grace Episcopal Church stood on Nob Hill near the mansions of the wealthy, while a few blocks away, the Gold Dome Temple Emmanuel served one of the largest Jewish congregations west of the Mississippi. In Chinatown, Joss houses and temples held centuries of ritual and belief, tucked behind facades that most white San Franciscans rarely entered. In a neighborhood that was simultaneously exoticized by outsiders and treated with open hostility by city officials, who had tried for years to have it relocated or demolished. The new City Hall housed not just government offices but the courts and record halls where the machinery of a fast-growing city ground forward, often corruptly, under a political administration that historians would later describe as one of the most graft-ridden in the city's history. Public markets, saloons, and union halls served as informal gathering places where immigrant communities from Italy, Ireland, China, Mexico, and dozens of other origins negotiated an uneasy, layered coexistence. Step down from the hills and into the streets, and the real texture of the city reveals itself. Roughly 400,000 people were packed into a peninsula only about 7 miles by 7 miles, and the crowding showed. The smell of the waterfront, salt water and fish and coal smoke, mixed with roasting coffee along the Embarcadero and the yeasty warmth of dozens of bakeries. Newsboys shouted headlines on street corners. Horse-drawn wagons competed with electric streetcars and the last of the cable car lines for space on streets that were often just packed dirt beyond the main thoroughfares. Class lines were sharp and visible, from the silk-hatted financiers stepping out of the Palace Hotel to the dock workers and laundry workers crowded into boarding houses south of Market, where a single toilet might serve dozens of residents. Chinatown, with an estimated 15,000 residents in an area of barely a dozen blocks, was one of the most densely populated urban spaces in the entire country. And through all of it ran a restless, energetic optimism, a sense, common to boomtowns, that tomorrow would always be bigger than today. If one place captured that civic pride, it was the Cliff House, perched on the rocky bluffs above the Pacific at the western edge of the city. The building standing there in 1906, an elaborate 8-story chateau of towers and gables built by the mining magnate Adolf Sutro, had replaced an earlier version destroyed by fire just a few years before. Families rode the streetcar line all the way out to watch the sea lions on the rocks below, dine in its restaurants, and gaze out at a horizon that felt, on a clear day, like the edge of the known world. It was not the tallest or richest building in San Francisco, but it may have been the most beloved, a symbol that this raw young city on the edge of a continent had built something genuinely magical for everyone, rich or poor, to enjoy. For a glimpse of how the other half lived when the sightseeing was done, you needed only to climb Nob Hill, where the railroad baron Charles Crocker and his fellow rail magnates had built a row of mansions so opulent that the hill's name became a byword for extravagant wealth. The Crocker mansion alone occupied most of a city block, its rooms filled with imported tapestries, gilded mirrors, and art collected on European tours that lasted months at a time. Servants' quarters, private stables, and conservatories of tropical plants completed estates that felt more like European palaces than California homes. Yet for all their marble staircases and imported chandeliers, these houses stood on the same unstable ground as the tenements below them. Whatever was coming for San Francisco would not check a resident's bank balance before it arrived. At 5:12 in the morning, the ground began to move. Along nearly 300 miles of the San Andreas Fault, from Mendocino County in the north down toward San Juan Bautista in the south, tectonic plates that had been locked together for decades finally slipped, releasing a burst of energy now estimated at magnitude 7.9. The initial jolt lasted perhaps 20 to 25 seconds, though eyewitnesses would later swear it felt far longer, and it struck with a violence that toppled chimneys, cracked facades, and sent City Hall's celebrated dome crashing down into rubble, leaving only its iron skeleton standing against the morning sky. In the first moments, many residents believed they were experiencing a passing tremor, something the city had weathered before. What they could not yet see was that broken gas lines and severed electrical wires across the city were already sparking dozens of small fires, and that the very earthquake which had cracked building foundations had also fractured water mains throughout the city, draining the pressure firefighters would desperately need in the hours ahead. Over the next 3 days, those scattered fires merged into a single firestorm that consumed more than 4 square miles of the city, moving at times faster than people could evacuate on foot. In a decision that remains controversial among historians, military and civilian authorities dynamited entire blocks of buildings in an attempt to create firebreaks, a strategy that in several documented cases likely spread the flames further rather than stopping them. Temperatures inside the fire zone are believed to have exceeded 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit in places, hot enough to melt glass and warp steel. Estimates of the dead vary considerably, but modern historians generally place the toll at more than 3,000 people, a number authorities at the time drastically undercounted, in part to protect the city's reputation and its ability to attract investment for rebuilding. In the weeks that followed, some 225,000 people, well over half the city's population, found themselves without homes. Refugee camps sprang up in Golden Gate Park and the Presidio, where Army-issued tents and hastily built earthquake cottages housed families for months and, in some cases, years. Looting was a real and documented problem in the fire's immediate aftermath, though later mythologized and exaggerated in newspaper accounts. City leaders, eager to reassure investors and tourists, launched an aggressive public relations campaign almost immediately, one that downplayed the destruction and emphasized a story of resilience and swift rebuilding, a narrative that shaped how the disaster would be remembered for decades afterward. Beneath the rubble, though, remarkable things survived. The steel frame of City Hall, though its dome had fallen, remained standing. Portions of the Palace Hotel's foundations endured the fire and were later incorporated into new construction. As crews cleared debris in the years that followed, they uncovered everyday objects, china dishes, children's toys, half-burned ledgers, ordinary fragments of lives that had been interrupted in an instant, offering historians and archaeologists an unusually intimate window into the daily reality of a city that had, in some neighborhoods, simply ceased to exist overnight. It is worth pausing on what that actually meant. Behind every collapsed facade was a bedroom, a kitchen table, a shopkeeper who had swept that same floor 1,000 mornings before. The dead were not statistics. They were bakers and stevedores and opera singers and children on their way to school. What burned in those 3 days was not just wood and brick, but the accumulated, unglamorous texture of ordinary life, the kind that rarely makes it into history books until it is gone. Stand at the corner of Market and Kearny Streets today, and you will find a city almost entirely rebuilt, its scars folded into a skyline of glass towers that would be unrecognizable to a survivor of 1906. City Hall, rebuilt between 1913 and 1915 in an even grander Beaux-Arts style, still crowns Civic Center with its dome, taller now than the original that fell. The Palace Hotel was reconstructed on the same footprint and still welcomes guests beneath a version of its famous glass-roofed court. The Nob Hill mansions of the railroad barons are gone, destroyed in the fire, though the stone retaining walls of the Flood Mansion survive as part of the private Pacific Union Club, one of the few tangible fragments of that lost gilded world. The Cliff House, rebuilt yet again after the disaster in a simpler style, continued to welcome visitors to the same dramatic bluff for more than a century, until it closed its doors in the early 2020s. Its future still debated as preservationists and the National Park Service weigh what comes next for the site. Chinatown, remarkably, was rebuilt by its own residents in a matter of years, reasserting its place in the city against officials who had hoped the disaster might let them relocate it entirely. And in 1915, less than a decade after the ground opened beneath it, San Francisco hosted the Panama Pacific International Exposition, a dazzling World's Fair built specifically to announce to the globe that the city had risen again, whole, ambitious, and unbroken. Thanks so much for spending this time with me and walking through 1906 San Francisco. If there's a place or a moment in history you'd love to see brought back to life like this, drop it in the comments below. I read every one of them and they genuinely shape what we cover next. I'll see you in the next reconstruction.